Welcome to Sleepwalk Files. Tonight, we are taking a calm, close look at the Operation Northwoods false flag theory. Subscribe for daily stories about strange mysteries made to fall asleep to. Think about the things we are told to trust. We are taught that the primary job of a government is to protect its own people, to be the shield between the citizen and the chaos of the outside world. It's a comforting thought. But what happens when you find a document written in the sterile language of military bureaucracy that suggests the shield can be turned into a weapon? What happens when you realize that the people in charge of your safety were once openly discussing how to jeopardize it? This isn't a ghost story or a plot from a spy novel. It's a matter of public record, though it spent decades buried in the dark. It's called Operation Northwoods. If you've spent any time in the deeper corners of the internet, on forums like Reddit, or in the archives of conspiracy researchers, you've likely seen the name. It's often cited as the smoking gun for every theory about government deception. The central claim is simple and chilling. In 1962, the highest-ranking military officials in the United States proposed that the government commit acts of terrorism against its own citizens. Not as a mistake, and not as a side effect of some other mission, but as a calculated strategy. The goal was to create a reason for war. Specifically, they wanted a way to justify an invasion of Cuba to remove Fidel Castro from power. But they knew the American public wouldn't just wake up one morning and agree to a war in the Caribbean without a reason. They needed a catalyst. They needed a tragedy. Imagine a top-secret memorandum typed on official letterhead outlining a series of provocations. The plan wasn't just to lie about an enemy attack. It was to actually stage those attacks. The proposal suggested that CIA operatives should orchestrate violence on US soil, blow things up, and kill people, all while leaving a trail of evidence that pointed directly at the Cuban government. It sounds like a fever dream. You might find yourself thinking, our government would never do that. That's the reaction people on those forums say the state is banking on. They call it the instant dismissal. But when you look at the actual documents, the cold, clinical tone of the writing is what makes it truly eerie. There are no apologies in these pages. There is no moral hesitation. There is only the logistical planning of how to manufacture a crisis. The documents describe a world where the truth is a flexible tool. The idea was to create a narrative so convincing and so heartbreaking that the world would scream for retaliation. They weren't looking for a subtle push. They were looking for a shove. They wanted the American public to be so outraged, so terrified, that they would practically beg the government to launch an invasion. Why does this story still linger? Why does it keep people awake at night 60 years later? It's because Operation Northwoods provides a blueprint. It proves that the imagination of the state is capable of things we usually only attribute to villains in movies. It suggests that the line between protecting the country and attacking the people can become dangerously blurred when the stakes of the Cold War are high enough. When you see those screenshots of the declassified memos circulating online, you're seeing a glimpse into a mindset where citizens are viewed as assets to be manipulated rather than people to be protected. It raises a question that is almost too heavy to carry. If they were willing to propose this in 1962, what else has been proposed since? And more importantly, which of those plans actually made it off the paper? As we peel back the layers of this operation, we have to ask how you even begin to fake a tragedy on that scale. How do you make a lie look like a massacre? How do you ensure that the evidence points exactly where you want it to go? To understand that, we have to look at the specific tactics they plan to use, the false flags that were designed to deceive the entire world. If you wanted to convince the entire world that a foreign power had just declared war on the United States, where would you start? You couldn't just release a press statement. You'd need something visceral. You'd need blood in the water and smoke in the sky. The architects of Operation Northwoods knew that for a lie to work, it had to be witnessed. It had to be documented. It had to feel inevitable. The documents reveal a level of theatrical precision that is almost clinical. One of the most chilling suggestions involved the waters of Guantanamo Bay. The plan wasn't just to have a ship sink. It was to blow up a US vessel and then carefully curate the aftermath. They didn't just want a wreck. They wanted a narrative. The proposal suggested that the wreckage should be meticulously staged to look like a Cuban attack, ensuring that the evidence left behind would leave no room for doubt in the eyes of the public. Imagine the coordination required for that. The timing, the placement of the explosives, the curated reports from the survivors. It wasn't just a military operation. It was a scripted tragedy. But the ocean wasn't the only stage they considered. The Joint Chiefs were thinking about the air. This is where the plan moves from the realm of sabotage into something that feels like a psychological thriller. They proposed using duplicate aircraft. They wanted to take planes that looked exactly like Cuban military aircraft, fly them into US airspace, and create a scene of aggression. The idea was to mimic the movements of an enemy force so convincingly that radar operators and eyewitnesses would swear they saw Cuban planes violating American sovereignty. Think about the sheer audacity of that. They weren't talking about a few secret agents in the dark. They were talking about using the very tools of national defense to create a phantom enemy. They wanted to manufacture a threat that didn't exist, using the government's own hardware to do it. It's the ultimate shell game. You create the crisis, you provide the evidence, and then you offer the only logical solution, an invasion. When people dive into these archives today, they often get hung up on the term false flag. It sounds like something from a spy novel or a fringe forum, but the term actually dates back to the 16th century. In naval warfare, a ship would fly the flag of a neutral or allied nation to get close to an enemy without being detected. Once they were in range, they'd drop the fake flag, hoist their own colors, and open fire. Operation Northwoods was simply the Cold War version of that old naval trick, only the enemy they were sneaking up on wasn't a foreign fleet. It was the American people. There is a specific kind of horror in the details. The planners weren't just guessing, they were calculating. They discussed how to handle the casualties. They looked at how to manipulate the media to ensure the story broke in a way that maximized panic. Every detail was designed to trigger a specific emotional response. They knew that if they could create enough fear, the public wouldn't ask questions about the logistics. They wouldn't wonder why the evidence seemed too perfect. They would just want the enemy stopped. This is why the story doesn't just stay in the history books. If you spend any time on sites like Reddit, you'll see these documents cited constantly. Users in conspiracy circles point to Northwoods as the smoking gun that proves the state is capable of this kind of deception. They argue that once a blueprint like this is created, it doesn't just disappear. They ask if the tactics used in the 1962 proposal, the duplicate planes, the staged explosions, the curated evidence, became standard operating procedure for later events. It makes you wonder about the nature of the official story. When we hear about a tragedy, we usually trust the reports because the alternative, that the tragedy was designed, is too disturbing to contemplate. But Northwoods removes that shield. It shows that the most unthinkable scenario was, at one point, a formal proposal sitting on a desk in the Department of Defense. It transforms the impossible into a documented possibility, and that is the first crack in the wall. Once you realize the government was willing to write it down, you start wondering what else they were willing to actually do. To understand how a group of the most decorated officers in American history could suggest killing their own people, you have to look at the world they were living in. Imagine it's 1962. The air is thick with a kind of static electricity, a constant, low-humming anxiety that the world might end in a flash of white light before the week is over. This was the peak of the Cold War, a time when the globe was sliced in two by an invisible line, and any movement across that line was seen as an act of war. For the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the situation in the Caribbean wasn't just a political problem, it was a personal failure. Only 2 years earlier, in April 1961, the United States had attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro through the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was a disaster, a botched landing, a lack of air support, and a total collapse of intelligence. The CIA had promised a popular uprising that never happened. Instead, the world watched as American-backed exiles were captured or killed on the beaches of Cuba. The embarrassment was total. For the military brass, the Bay of Pigs wasn't just a tactical loss, it was a bruise on the ego of the superpower. They felt the United States looked weak, and in the logic of the Cold War, weakness was an invitation for the Soviet Union to push further. The fear wasn't just about Castro himself, but about the red shadow he cast over the Western Hemisphere. They believed that if Cuba remained a communist stronghold just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, it was only a matter of time before the Soviets turned the island into a permanent aircraft carrier. This is where the pressure cooker starts to whistle. By early 1962, the military hierarchy felt they were running out of options. They had tried covert infiltration, they had tried diplomatic isolation, and they had tried a direct, albeit secret, invasion. None of it worked. They were desperate. When you are desperate, the boundaries of what is reasonable begin to shift. The moral compass doesn't necessarily break, but it starts to point in a different direction, one where the greater good of national security outweighs the lives of a few dozen civilians or soldiers. Think about the mindset of the men in those rooms. These were officers who had fought in World War II. They viewed the world in terms of total war and strategic necessity. To them, the provocations suggested in Northwoods weren't seen as crimes. They were seen as tools. In their eyes, they weren't attacking Americans. They were creating a narrative. They believed that the American public would only support an invasion of Cuba if there was a clear, undeniable reason to be angry. They weren't looking for a legal justification. They were looking for an emotional one. It was a gamble born of a specific kind of Cold War arrogance. They believed they could curate reality itself. If the public didn't want a war, the military would simply give them a reason to crave one. They saw the citizens not as people to be protected, but as a demographic to be managed. The desperation to remove Castro had become so blinding that the idea of blowing up a ship or staging a bombing felt like a logical step in a larger game of chess. But here is the question that still lingers in the archives. Did they actually believe the public would be fooled? Or did they believe that once the first bomb went off, the momentum of fear would be so strong that no one would even bother to check the evidence? They were operating in a world before the internet, before instant leaks, and before a general distrust of the official narrative. They assumed they controlled the microphones and the printing presses. They assumed that the state's word was the only word that mattered. This atmosphere of extreme tension and perceived failure created a vacuum where the unthinkable became a line item on a memo. The Joint Chiefs weren't acting as rogue agents in a basement. They were acting as the highest military authority in the land, driven by a cocktail of professional humiliation and genuine geopolitical terror. They were convinced that the only way to save the future was to manufacture a tragedy in the present. If you were to look at the original documents today, you wouldn't see a handwritten note or a frantic series of cables. You would see a formal, typed memorandum. It looks like any other piece of bureaucratic paperwork from the early 60s, complete with the standard margins and the cold, sterile language of the Pentagon. But this isn't a report on troop movements or a budget request for new aircraft. It is a blueprint for a crime. The date at the top of the page is March 13, 1962. That is the day the unthinkable became a formal proposal. This wasn't some rogue operation run by a few low-level agents in a dark room. This was a coordinated effort from the very top of the American military hierarchy. The document was officially titled Operation Northwoods, and it was addressed to Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense. Think about that for a second. Robert McNamara was one of the most powerful men in the world at the time. He was the man who managed the logistics of the Cold War. The Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't just whisper these ideas in a hallway, they put them in a top-secret memo and handed it to him on a silver platter. They wanted his signature. They wanted the civilian leadership of the United States to sign off on the slaughter of its own people. When you dig into the paper trail, the names are what really make the skin crawl. We aren't talking about anonymous officers. These were the 6 highest-ranking military leaders in the country, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The men responsible for the defense of the nation were the ones proposing that the nation be attacked. They didn't view this as a betrayal. In their minds, they were simply providing the Secretary of Defense with a set of options. It's the banality of it that bothers people the most. The memo doesn't use words like murder or terrorism. It uses terms like provocations and simulated attacks. It treats the idea of blowing up a ship or killing civilians as a tactical necessity, a series of checkboxes to be ticked off before an invasion could begin. There are no moral hesitations written into the margins. No one wrote, "Are we sure this is right?" Instead, they focused on the logistics. They focused on how to make the lies believable. For decades, this document didn't exist in the public eye. It was buried in the archives, hidden behind layers of classification. If you had mentioned Operation Northwoods in a coffee shop in 1970, people would have called you a lunatic. They would have told you that the government simply doesn't work that way. But the paper trail doesn't lie. The documents were eventually declassified, and suddenly the lunatics had a smoking gun. The fascination for modern researchers and forum users comes from the fact that this isn't a theory based on a missing witness or a blurry photograph. It's based on a signed piece of paper. When people on sites like Reddit discuss false flags today, they often point back to March 13, 1962, as the definitive proof that the state is capable of imagining these things. They argue that if the Joint Chiefs could propose it once, they could have proposed it 1,000 times more. It leaves us with a chilling question about the nature of power. If the highest-ranking officers in the military felt comfortable putting these plans in writing, who was actually in control? Was it the president? Or was there a shadow layer of the military-industrial complex that operated on a logic entirely separate from the law? The memo was a formal request for permission to lie to the world. It was a request to turn the American public into unwitting actors in a staged play where the cost of admission was human life. And while the document tells us who signed it and who received it, it doesn't tell us how many other memos like it were burned before they could ever be archived. It only tells us that for one day in March, the official policy of the United States military was to consider the death of its own citizens as a viable political tool. If you stop and look at the actual language used in the Northwoods memo, you start to realize that the Joint Chiefs weren't just talking about a few isolated incidents. They weren't just suggesting a single, controlled explosion on a remote base. They were talking about a campaign of terror. The question isn't just whether they were willing to lie, but exactly how much blood they were willing to spill to make that lie believable. When you dig into the most extreme sections of the proposal, the plan moves from military deception into something that looks more like a script for a horror movie. One of the most disturbing suggestions involved the cities of Florida. The Joint Chiefs proposed staging a series of terrorist bombings in American urban centers. Imagine it. The sirens, the smoke, the panic in the streets of Miami or Tampa. All of it carefully choreographed by the Department of Defense, then pinned on Fidel Castro. They wanted the public to feel a visceral, immediate sense of danger in their own backyards. Why? Because fear is the most effective way to bypass a population's critical thinking. If people are terrified, they don't ask for evidence, they ask for a war. Then there was the plan for the skies. The memo detailed the possibility of hijacking planes. Not just any planes, but civilian aircraft. The idea was to create a scenario where a flight would be diverted or destroyed, with the evidence pointing directly back to Cuban agents. They even discussed the use of duplicate aircraft. They wanted to fly planes that looked exactly like Cuban military jets over American cities, creating a visual panic, before perhaps having those same planes shot down or crashed in a way that looked like an act of aggression. It was a psychological operation designed to make the American people feel besieged. But the deception didn't stop at bombs and planes. The Joint Chiefs proposed creating fake refugees. They wanted to manufacture a humanitarian crisis by staging scenes of Cuban cruelty and pushing people toward the US border under fabricated circumstances. They wanted to curate the images the world saw. They wanted to create a narrative of a regime so monstrous that the only moral response would be an immediate, full-scale invasion. It was an attempt to engineer the very soul of public opinion. If you spend any time on forums like Reddit, you'll see people obsessing over these specific details. They aren't looking at the big picture, they're looking at the mechanics. They ask how the military would have managed the cleanup. How do you blow up a building in a Florida city without your own operatives getting caught? How do you coordinate a fake refugee crisis without a single whistleblower stepping forward? To the modern conspiracy researcher, these aren't impossible hurdles. They're just logistical problems. They argue that if the Joint Chiefs were bold enough to write these things down in a top-secret memo, they had already figured out the logistics. There is a specific kind of dread that comes from reading these proposals. It's the realization that the people in charge of the nation's defense were treating the American public as a variable in an equation. In their eyes, a few dead civilians in Miami were a fair price to pay for a strategic victory in the Caribbean. The human cost wasn't the deterrent. It was the catalyst. Think about the sheer audacity of it. These men weren't rogue agents or low-level operatives acting on their own. They were the highest-ranking officers in the land. They were the people who had sworn an oath to protect the Constitution and the lives of the citizens it governs. Yet, here they were, proposing to use those same citizens as bait. When you look at the documents, you don't see hesitation. You don't see a "what if this goes wrong" section. You see a cold, calculated list of provocations. It reads like a menu of atrocities. You can almost hear the quiet, sterile tone of the briefing room where this was discussed. No one is shouting. No one is arguing about the morality of it. They are simply discussing the most efficient way to trick a nation into a war. It makes you wonder what other menus were drafted in those same rooms and which ones were actually ordered. If the plan was so detailed and the signatures were already on the page, why aren't we looking back at the 1960s as the era of the Great Deception? Why did these proposals, written by the most powerful military minds in the country, simply vanish into a filing cabinet? This is the wall of denial. This is the point where the story shifts from a horror movie script to a bureaucratic dead end. The skeptical explanation is actually quite simple. It comes down to one man. On March 13, 1962, the memorandum was delivered to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. From there, it went to the desk of President John F. Kennedy. And according to the official record, Kennedy didn't just say no. He rejected the entire premise. He didn't want a manufactured war based on a lie. He understood that if the public ever found out the government had bombed its own cities to justify an invasion, the resulting chaos would be far worse than any threat coming from Havana. In the world of government hierarchy, the Joint Chiefs of Staff have immense power, but they don't have the authority to start a war on their own. They can propose, they can plan, and they can lobby, but they need the executive green light. Without Kennedy's signature, Operation Northwoods was nothing more than a very dark piece of stationery. It was a blueprint for a house that was never built. The military hierarchy had reached for the trigger, but the president had his hand on their wrist. But for those who spend their time in the deep corners of the internet, that explanation feels too clean. On forums like Reddit, the official record is often viewed as just another layer of the cover-up. They ask a haunting question. Just because the memo was rejected doesn't mean the mindset was. They argue that Northwoods wasn't a one-time mistake, but a proof of concept. If the Joint Chiefs were comfortable writing these things down, who's to say they didn't find a different way to achieve the same goal? The skeptics point out that Kennedy was famously cautious during the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later. He resisted the pressure from his generals to launch a full-scale invasion of Cuba, even when the world was on the brink of nuclear war. This supports the idea that he was the firewall. He was the one man standing between the American public and a series of staged tragedies. Yet there's a strange tension in this narrative. We're told that the system worked. We're told that the checks and balances of the US government prevented a catastrophe. But that realization brings its own kind of chill. It means that the only thing stopping the government from attacking its own people was the personal morality of one president. It means the machinery for these atrocities was already built, oiled, and ready to run. The denial isn't that the plan didn't exist, but that it was ever truly gone. Think about the logistics of a rejection. When a top-secret memo is denied, it doesn't usually get shredded immediately. It stays in the archives. It sits in a folder waiting. For decades, the public had no idea this document even existed. It only came to light years later through declassification. This gap in time is where the suspicion grows. If the government was willing to hide the mere proposal of these acts for so long, what else have they hidden? Was Northwoods really just a failed experiment in imagination? Or was it a trial run for a different kind of warfare? One where the battlefield is the public's perception of reality. The official story tells us the wall of denial was an act of presidential restraint. But to the conspiracy researcher, that wall isn't there to protect us from the truth of the past. It's there to hide the fact that the blueprint is still being used. How does a dusty piece of paper from 1962 travel through time to become the fuel for a million internet arguments today? It's a strange journey. For decades, Operation Northwoods was a footnote in history, a secret kept in a vault. But then came the digital age. The documents were declassified, uploaded to the web, and suddenly they weren't just history anymore. They became a weapon. They became a lens through which millions of people began to view every major tragedy of the modern era. If you spend any time on forums like Reddit, specifically in the deeper corners of the conspiracy community, you'll see Northwoods mentioned constantly. It's not cited as a historical event, but as a proof of concept. The argument is simple. If the Joint Chiefs of Staff were willing to propose blowing up their own ships and bombing their own cities in 1962, why would we assume they stopped thinking that way? To the digital sleuth, Northwoods isn't a failed plan. It's the blueprint. It's the evidence that the false flag isn't just a trope from spy movies, but a documented strategy of the American military-industrial complex. This is where the rabbit hole gets deep. Users on these forums start connecting dots that aren't necessarily there, but feel inevitable. They look at the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995, the devastation of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, and they don't see a lone wolf like Timothy McVeigh. They see the ghost of Northwoods. They ask the same question that the 1962 memo answered. Who benefits? They argue that if the government wanted to justify a crackdown on domestic militias or increase surveillance in the 90s, they had a precedent. They had a manual on how to manufacture a crisis to achieve a political goal. It becomes a cycle of suspicion. A tragedy happens, the official narrative is released, and within hours, a PDF of the Northwoods memo is linked in a comment thread. It's used as a conversational gotcha. The logic goes like this. You might think the government would never attack its own people, but here is a signed document from the highest-ranking officers in the land saying they wanted to do exactly that. Once that seed is planted, the official story for any event, no matter how well documented, starts to look like a cover-up. The fascination isn't just about the politics, though. It's about the psychological thrill of the hidden truth. There's a specific kind of energy in those forums, a feeling of being awake while everyone else is sleeping. They call it breaking the spell. When you see the names and the dates in the Northwoods file, it feels like you've found a glitch in the matrix. It transforms the government from a clumsy bureaucracy into a calculating, invisible hand that orchestrates reality. But there's a darker side to this digital echo. When Northwoods becomes the primary lens for interpreting the world, nothing is ever real. Every bombing, every mass shooting, every sudden political shift is dismissed as a staged provocation. The document that was meant to warn us about the dangers of unchecked military power has, in a strange way, been used to erode the very idea of objective truth. If everything is a false flag, then nothing is. Still, the documents remain. You can find them online, scanned and stark. They aren't rumors or hearsay, they are official government records. That's why the theory refuses to die. You can't argue away a signature. You can't debunk a memo that the government itself admitted to writing. The digital echo of Operation Northwoods persists because it provides a concrete anchor for an abstract fear. It tells the skeptic that their paranoia isn't a mental illness, it's a historical observation. It suggests that the most dangerous thing about the plan wasn't that it was proposed, but that it was possible. And in the eyes of the internet, once a door like that is opened, it can never truly be closed. If you were to walk into the National Archives today and look through the declassified files of the early 60s, you would find a piece of paper that changes how you look at every news report you've ever heard. It isn't a handwritten note or a leaked rumor from a disgruntled employee. It is a formal, typed memorandum. It has a date. It has a classification level, and most importantly, it has signatures. But the real question that keeps people awake at night isn't whether Operation Northwoods was written. We know it was. The question is, if the Joint Chiefs of Staff were willing to suggest it once, what else did they suggest that never got declassified? That is the lingering shadow. The psychological weight of Northwoods doesn't come from the plan itself, but from the realization that the threshold for unthinkable is much lower than we were taught in history class. We like to believe there is a moral line that the state simply cannot cross, a hard boundary where the safety of the citizen outweighs the goals of the empire. But the Northwoods memo proves that, for the people at the very top, that line was just a suggestion. It suggests that the lives of American citizens in Florida or the sailors in Guantanamo Bay were, in the eyes of the military hierarchy, nothing more than disposable props in a larger geopolitical theater. When you spend enough time in the darker corners of the web, you start to see this pattern everywhere. On forums like Reddit, users don't just talk about 1962. They apply the Northwoods logic to everything. They look at the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995, and they don't see a lone wolf. They see a potential, staged provocation designed to justify new surveillance laws. They look at modern conflicts in the Middle East, and they ask the same question that became the mantra of the skeptic: who actually benefits from this? The logic is simple and devastating. If the government admitted it was willing to kill its own people to start a war with Cuba, Why would we assume they stopped thinking that way once the Cold War ended? Of course, the official record says Kennedy shut it down. The skeptics say the plan died on his desk. But for those who can't stop thinking about it, that isn't a comfort. In fact, it's more terrifying. It means the plan was rejected by one man, not by a system of ethics. It means the military didn't stop wanting to do it. They just didn't have the permission. It leaves us wondering about the gaps in the record. We have the memo that failed. But do we have the memos for the plans that succeeded? Think about the nature of a secret. A secret only stays a secret if the people involved are disciplined. But governments are rarely disciplined. They leak, they stumble, and eventually, documents are declassified decades later when the players are all dead and the danger has passed. Northwoods is a ghost that haunts the present because it provides a concrete, documented precedent for the most extreme conspiracy theories. It transforms paranoia into a historical observation. It tells the listener that the crazy theory isn't actually crazy. It's just a theory that has already been proposed in a top-secret meeting. That is why the story still bothers us. It's not about Cuba, and it's not about the 60s. It's about the fragility of trust. Every time a new tragedy happens, and the official narrative feels a little too polished, a little too convenient, the ghost of Operation Northwoods returns. It whispers that the truth is often hidden in a file cabinet in Washington, signed by men who viewed the public as a tool to be manipulated. We want to believe we live in a world of accidents and organic events, but Northwoods suggests a world of scripts and choreography. It suggests that the history we read in textbooks is just the version that was approved for public consumption. As you drift off, you might find yourself wondering about the files that are still classified. The ones that will stay hidden for another 50 years. The ones that contain signatures from men who are still in power, proposing things that would make the Northwoods memo look like a rehearsal. The door was opened in 1962, and no matter how many times we tell ourselves it was closed, we can still feel the cold draft coming from the other side. If you dig deeper into the archives, you find that Northwoods wasn't just a random spark of cruelty. It was the peak of a very specific, very dark culture within the Department of Defense during the early 60s. To understand the mindset of the men who signed that memo, you have to look at the ghosts of the Bay of Pigs. That disaster in April 1961 had left the Joint Chiefs of Staff humiliated. They had tried to use exiled Cubans to topple Castro, and it had failed spectacularly on the beaches of Cuba. By the time March 1962 rolled around, the military wasn't just looking for a victory. They were looking for a way to force the hand of a president who they felt was too cautious. There are those who point to the specific language in the Northwoods documents as a clue to how these things actually work. The memo doesn't use words like murder or terrorism. It uses clinical terms like provocations and pretexts. It treats the American public not as citizens to be protected, but as a variable to be managed. When you read the actual declassified pages, you see the cold logic of a boardroom meeting applied to the deaths of innocent people. They discuss the timing of the attacks to ensure maximum psychological impact. They plan the specific locations in Florida to make the threat feel immediate and visceral. Some researchers have spent years scouring the National Archives, looking for the companion pieces to the Northwoods memo. They argue that a proposal this detailed doesn't just appear out of thin air. It implies a series of preliminary drafts, smaller tests, and perhaps even dry runs that were never officially recorded. They look for gaps in the logs of the ships stationed at Guantanamo Bay or unexplained exercises in the Caribbean during that window of time. Was there a version of Northwoods that was smaller, quieter, and actually executed without the president's knowledge? Then there are the online circles, the digital detectives on forums who link Northwoods to every modern tragedy that feels too convenient. They bring up the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995, questioning if the official narrative of a lone wolf was just another polished script. They ask why certain security protocols were down or why some evidence seemed to vanish. To them, Northwoods isn't just a historical curiosity. It is the smoking gun that proves the government is capable of the unthinkable. It serves as the permanent evidence that the blueprint for a false flag exists, signed and dated in the official record. Whether you believe those theories or not, the document remains. It sits there in the archives, a quiet reminder that the line between national security and state-sponsored terror is thinner than we like to imagine. It tells us that the most dangerous weapon in the arsenal isn't a bomb or a missile. It's a piece of paper, written in a quiet office, that decides who the enemy is. And once that paper is signed, the truth becomes whatever the people in power say it is. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to Sleepwalk Files to stay up to date with new mysteries and long videos to fall asleep to every night.